Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second of 3 workshop sessions that are part of our 2022 Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Summit. Last Thursday afternoon, our first workshop session addressed equitable school funding and the We the People campaign's top priorities. We're going to put some links to the recordings of those workshops in the chat. Today, Susan Gabreski, who is the senior consultant for Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, and me, Mark Steer, the director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, are going to be talking about the future of democracy in Pennsylvania. I'm going to share my screen with our slides so you can see that. That working? Cool.
It is.
Cool. So we kind of revised the title a little bit because the issue is really whether our democracy in Pennsylvania is going to be destroyed or whether it's going to be renewed, because the threats to our democracy are incredibly serious right now. Here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about some basic government and politics 101, things you may have learned in elementary school or high school, about the separation of checks and balances. And we'll talk about how they and the representative democracy in Pennsylvania as a whole are being threatened by some constitutional amendments that have been proposed by the Republican majority in Harrisburg. Then we're going to talk a little bit about elections and voting, about some of the threats that make elections and voting more difficult for people. We'll also talk about the constitutional amendment process. You'll see how we think that those amendments should be considered and why the current process has been of considering these amendments and moving them to the ballot is broken. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to expand democracy in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to get started and talk about some of the basic features of our democracy that that you probably remember about, but I think it would be helpful to remind you, because sadly, these issues are no longer ancient history or early American history. They are current history. Remember, the basic idea of the checks and balances is that we have three powers of government. We have the legislative power, we have the executive power, and we have the judicial power. Each of those three powers of government are mainly given to 3 branches of government. That is, the legislative power is mostly in the hands of the General Assembly in Pennsylvania. The executive power is mostly in the hands of the governor in Pennsylvania. And the judicial power is mostly in the hands of the courts in Pennsylvania. Now, there's a reason we separate these powers into different institutions. Basic idea is we want government to be conducted by the rule of law. Before government acts, there should be a law, and that law should constrain how that law is carried out by the governor. And then the constitutionality of the law and decisions of the law should be evaluated, and actions by the governor should be evaluated by the courts to ensure that the Constitution is followed, the laws are properly interpreted. We don't want governments deciding, as they do in autocratic societies, that someone is guilty and he should be put in jail without any due process of law, without law being established, without someone being prosecuted and then being convicted by the courts. So that's what we call the separation of powers. Now, in our system, as I said, the separation of powers means that each of those powers is given to one particular branch of government. But we also have something called the checks and balances in the United States and in every state government. And what the checks and balances means is that while each power is given primarily to one branch of government, the other branches of government share in that power. So, for example, the legislative power is mostly given in Pennsylvania to the General Assembly, but the governor has some role in exercising the legislative power. The governor can veto legislation, he can veto concurrent resolutions, and the General Assembly can override those vetoes, but only with 2/3 of the vote. The executive power is mainly given to the governor, but the governor's actions can be checked by the General Assembly. The governor, for example, can issue executive orders, and the General Assembly can overturn them with majority 2/3 votes. The governor can issue regulations under the laws created by the General Assembly. And if the General Assembly doesn't like those regulations, they can pass legislation to overturn them. But the governor can veto that. It actually passes a concurrent resolution to overturn them. The governor can veto it, but the General Assembly can override the governor's decision with a 2/3 vote. Similarly, the courts make decisions using the judicial power, but the governor and the General Assembly both have a share in the judicial power. The governor appoints, the governor can make temporary appointments in the judges. The governor can recommend changes in the structure of the judiciary, and the courts can, rather the legislature can pass laws changing to some extent what the courts consider and what cases they consider and where, and regulating the conduct of the judicial power. So we have checks and balances. What's my?
Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Your slide is cut off in the visual. I'm gonna just wanted to alert you. I'm gonna share my screen so you can keep going. So it's just it's chopped off.
It's chopped off. Okay.
Okay, I think we're good. Continue. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay. So yeah, so I was talking about checks and balances, and okay, now I can. I couldn't see your slide. The slide from there. Okay, so and then underlying all these checks and balances is what James Madison called our Republican government, or what we call today representative democracy. Power is held by government officials who are chosen directly or indirectly by the people. So as we know, each of these branches of government are chosen by the people. The people elect the governor, they elect the General Assembly. In some states and the federal government, they don't elect the courts. They're chosen indirectly by the governor and the General Assembly working together. In Pennsylvania, however, we directly elect the members of our courts. So here's the big threat to our democracy. One is that could lose control over our General Assembly. We can lose democratic control over our General Assembly through the gerrymandering of legislative districts. To some extent, this has happened in the past. As we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit, we've just finishing 20 years in which legislative districts were heavily gerrymandered to favor the Republican Party. The legislative districts that are going to be conducted in the 2024 election, however, will be in the 2022 election, however, will be new legislative districts that are much fairer. There are constitutional amendment proposals that would give the General Assembly even more control over its election districts than they had in the past, which means the majority party could basically cement its control over the General Assembly in the future. And then the second threat is that the General Assembly gains power over the other branches, and that it expands its power and minimizes the power over the other branches of government. If those two things happen, if we lose control of the General Assembly and the General Assembly gains power over the governor and over the courts, then the checks and balances will be undermined and our whole democracy will be undermined. So let me talk about some of the things that are going on that lead us to worry about these threats. Let's go on to the next slide. Let's skip this slide. I already talked about this. How is the General Assembly seeking control over the governor? Well, it's already done that to a certain extent. As you know, the governor had emergency powers. He could declare emergency, he could renew that emergency. Um, and that's what he did under as a result of the COVID pandemic. He took emergency powers, and called for shutting down businesses and for social distancing and various other steps to control the spread of the pandemic. As you know, the General Assembly disagreed with those decisions, leaving aside the question of whether those decisions were right or not. And as you probably know, we at PVPC believe that they were right decisions. They saved 15 to 20,000 lives in Pennsylvania at a minimum. The General Assembly passed 2 constitutional amendments and sent them to the voters, who approved them in May 2021. One of those constitutional amendments holds that the governor's power to issue an emergency order expires after 21 days. So now the governor can issue an emergency order, but it runs out in 21 days. The second thing they did is they expanded their power to end a governor's emergency declaration. In the past, if the General Assembly wanted to end an emergency declaration, they would have to pass a concurrent resolution, which could be vetoed by the governor. And that's in fact what happened. The General Assembly passed a concurrent resolution to end the governor's emergency powers under which he exercised the pandemic safety rules. And then the governor vetoed that concurrent resolution, and the emergency orders continued. Under the constitutional amendment passed in May 21, concurrent resolutions to end emergencies are no longer subject to the governor's veto, or more precisely, the governor's veto can be overturned by simply a majority vote. But that's specifically with regard to go back. We're not going ahead yet. That's specifically with regard to emergencies. So that's a limitation of the governor's power. There are, however, a number of constitutional amendments, and we've listed them here. Some are in SB 106, some are in HB 2069. These are laws to put constitutional amendments on the ballot that would much more diminish the power of the governor. For example, one of them would basically remove the governor's power to veto any concurrent resolutions, which means the General Assembly could pass those resolutions with a majority vote without the governor playing any role. One way in which that would be used is that the General Assembly could overturn regulations issued by the governor. Now, let's be clear. When the governor issues regulations, he does it subject to a law passed by the General Assembly and signed by a previous governor. Governors can't just issue regulations, except for emergency regulations, without the General Assembly acting. That's what we mean by a rule of law. General Assembly passes a law, say a law to control environmental problems, or say to limit pollution. The governor issues a regulation subject to that law. And that is classically an executive power. That's part of what we mean by executive power, issuing regulations under laws. Now, what the General Assembly wants to do is to be able to overturn the governor's regulations with simple majority vote. Right now, they can do it with a 2/3 majority. And if the amendments they're proposing were adopted by the people of Pennsylvania, the governor would issue regulations. The general would say we don't like those regulations, and with simple majority vote that the governor could not veto, the regulations would be overturned. Now, this may sound very abstract, but this is a fundamental intrusion on the power of the governor. It's the legislature saying, not only do we want to make the laws, but we want to decide how those laws are executed. And if you remember what checks and balances mean, and separation of powers mean, the lawmaking function is separated from the executive function. And what the General Assembly is proposing under these amendments is to combine the legislative function and the executive function under their control. And that's something really, really worrisome, because it means if the governor can't issue regulations, he loses executive power, the General Assembly becomes a lot more powerful. Similarly, the General Assembly has another amendment in SB 106 that would overturn the right of the governor to issue proclamations. Now, frankly, most proclamations aren't that big a deal. if the governor were to proclaim that today is, as a special day to remember whatever happened in history. I think Bitches Brew was released by Miles Davis in 1968 on this day. So if Governor Wolf were to pass a proclamation saying this is Bitches Brew Day, and the governor and the General Assembly were to override that proclamation, which they could very well do, I don't think we'd worry too much about it. But some of those proclamations can be important because the executive order proclamations and executive orders are ways to implement laws. And again, this is a way for the governor to execute the laws, to carry out a fundamental executive function. And by taking away the power to issue those proclamations, the General Assembly is again expanding its power. And they could do one more thing. We always assume, that in the United States, governors veto legislation, and it takes a majority vote on the extraordinary majority, a 2/3 vote. In some states, it's a 3/5 vote to overturn a governor's veto. That's actually not true everywhere. It's not true in Maryland. In Maryland, the legislature, state legislature in Maryland can overturn a governor's veto simply by majority vote. We have not seen that constitutional amendment in Pennsylvania yet, but I would not be surprised, particularly if a Democrat wins, if the General Assembly remains under the control of Republicans and a Democrat is elected to the governor's office in 2022, I would expect that the General Assembly would move constitutional amendments. If they continue along the line they're going, that would eliminate the governor's power to veto legislation. Again, a massive expansion of the General Assembly's power. All right, we were talking about General Assembly's control of the governor. Now let's look at the General Assembly's control over the courts. Next slide. Now, this is something we've been talking about a lot in the last year, judicial gerrymandering. So I'm going to review this relatively quickly because I think many of you have heard about it. As you know, all our appellate courts, judges and justices are elected at large statewide. That's the 7 Supreme Court justices, the 9 Commonwealth Court judges, and the 15 Superior Court judges. They're elected for a 10-year term, and then they have retention elections after 10 years. Now, there's one constitutional amendment being proposed that would eliminate those retention elections, would require them to run for re-election. But the bigger threat is in the constitutional amendment in HB 38, which would elect our judges in districts. Now, here's the problem with that. The general conceptual problem is that there's no Erie or Wilkes-Barre or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Harrisburg way to interpret the Constitution, interpret laws. Whereas with electing members of the General Assembly, we want local concerns to be brought to lawmaking. There aren't local concerns with regard to interpreting the Constitution and interpreting laws. That's a matter of the law, and we want the best possible people, no matter where they live in the state, to be elected to the courts. So that's the broader issue, but the deeper issue is the independence of the courts. If we elect our justices and judges in our 3 appellate courts in districts, then someone has to draw the districts. And here's the problem is that those districts can be gerrymandered. By gerrymandering those districts, the General Assembly majority could determine the political majority in our courts. They could take those 7 Supreme Court justices, divide them into 7 seats, draw 4 Republican-dominated seats, 3 Democratic-dominated seats, and for the rest of time, we would have a Republican majority in the Supreme Court. They could do the same thing with the Commonwealth Court and the Superior Courts. And here the issue isn't really, is it a Republican majority, is it a Democratic majority? It would, if the Democrats were in control of the General Assembly and they gerrymandered the judicial districts to elect a Democratic majority in the courts, that would still be wrong. Because the fundamental issue is the General Assembly should not be telling the courts what to do. To have checks and balances, the courts have to have some independence. And if the General Assembly is deciding what the lines are for electing people to the courts, they will in effect be deciding who is sitting on those courts. And it's not just, well, we'll draw lines to help elect a Democrat or Republican. But there's actually going to be a transition period from our current statewide elected judges to district elected judges. And during that transition period, as Supreme Court justices and Commonwealth Court judges and Superior Court judges' terms ends, the General Assembly could decide we're going to put this district somewhere so that a particular incumbent justice or judge cannot run for re-election. So imagine that Supreme Court Justice Wecht is term ended. He has to run a retention election, and they decide that his judicial district is going to be in Wilkes-Barre. Well, then Justice Wecht, who I believe lives in Pittsburgh, would have to decide either to move to Wilkes-Barre or to give up his seat. So the General Assembly could pick and choose which judges and justices they want to see on the court. This is a horrible expansion of the court's power of the General Assembly. And there's another one I'll briefly mention. There's another constitutional amendment besides the judicial gerrymandering amendment, HB 38, that's in HB 1910, which would limit state court rulemaking authority. In order to control what cases come before which courts, the Supreme, and to create rules for procedure for the courts, the Supreme Court's granted the power to set many of those rules. This constitutional amendment would give the General Assembly, not the Supreme Court, power to set those rules, which is again a tremendous expansion of the power of the General Assembly over courts. It's a direct violation of the checks and balances. So we have two things we've talked about so far: the General Assembly expanding its power. Let's go on to the next slide. Expanding its power over the courts, the General Assembly expanding its power over the governor's office. That is to say, the holder of legislative power taking a great deal of the executive power, taking a great deal of the judicial power. And the final piece of the puzzle is legislative gerrymandering. Under the current system, our legislative districts are chosen by a 5-person legislative reapportionment commission. One member is chosen from the majority minority party in the Senate. One member is chosen from the majority minority party in the House. Those are 4 members. The 5th member is chosen by the Supreme Court. In the last 2 decades, the Supreme Court has been controlled by the Republicans, and so we've had Republican gerrymandering, and which has meant we've had 2 decades of very extreme gerrymandering, which enabled Republicans to control majorities in the House and Senate, even though they did not win a majority of all the votes for House and Senate members in state. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But even when they didn't win a majority, they got a majority of the seats. Because Democrats control the Supreme Court right now, the 5th member of the Legislative Reapportionment Commission that just finished its work, that is, actually I made a mistake on the slide. We have fair districts as of this year, 2022. Because this Legislative Reapportionment Commission has drawn much fair districts. I should say the districts are still slightly tilted to benefit Republicans, but they're fundamentally fair in a way that they haven't been for the last two decades. Predictably, the Republicans, who seem to believe that elections are not fair unless they win, think that these districts are unfair. They're outraged by the fact that they're going to have to run under districts that are slightly benefit them instead of dramatically benefit them. So there's another constitutional amendment proposed in HB 2207, which would create an independent redistricting commission, which is something we've actually been fighting for a number of years. But the independent redistricting commission's plans could be rejected by the General Assembly. And under this constitutional amendment, ultimately, the House of Representatives would draw its own districts and the Senate would draw its own districts. There'd be no checks and balances on how House and Senate majorities draw the districts. And they're calling for a new redistricting in 2024. That is, they're going to reject what's supposed to be the 10-year plan adopted by the Legislative Reapportionment Commission just in the last month and say, we're going to do it again. And this time we're going to control the legislative redistricting. If Republicans still hold a majority of the House and Senate and pass this constitutional amendment and if they do it this year and then do it again in 2023, we will have new districts by 2024 controlled by the House and Senate. And not only controlled by the House and Senate in the way we've seen in the last 2 decades, there'll be absolutely no check, no balancing of what the House and Senate Republican majorities seek to do. Frankly, this is maybe the most concerning thing, because if a House majority and Senate majority can choose districts themselves, they can put themselves into power in perpetuity. So what this means is the General Assembly wants control over the governor, they want control over what the Supreme Court does, and they want to basically choose who votes for them, which means the checks and balances undermined, and democratic control over our 3 branches of government will be undermined. So basically they're saying, we're going to gerrymander our districts, we're going to gerrymander the judicial districts, and the one office we cannot gerrymander, the governor's office, because he's elected statewide, we're going to neuter the governor so he doesn't have any power to stop us. This is frankly legislative tyranny. And if these amendments move forward this year and next year, I think we can say goodbye to democracy in Pennsylvania. So on that cheery note, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Gabreski, who's going to talk about the constitutional amendments in some more detail and about the whole process. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Mark. That's amazing. And I love political science and advocacy all in one spot. And you embody it. So Mark talked a lot about the constitutional amendments. So the one question is, are constitutional amendments bad? And the answer to that is no. They're absolutely appropriate for certain types of things. They should be there to preserve fundamental rights. They should be there to help mitigate against momentary trends in popular opinion about things. So we want to protect people's rights, but they're not really meant to be legislative. They're not meant to be administrative. So a couple quick notes here. And we're going to provide some resources to you at the end, but there are over 70 amendments that the legislature has proposed. For those of you who don't know, the very quick thing is that a constitutional amendment, the process is as follows. It has to pass 2 sessions of the legislature, and in Pennsylvania, 1 session is 2 years. So it has to pass in 1 cycle, and then the second cycle, and then it goes to the public. The governor does not have a role in vetoing it. So it goes to the ballot, and then the voters become the legislators of sorts, and voters get to say yes or no. So traditionally in Pennsylvania, voters have said yes to a lot of things. And in fact, I think everything, or everything but one thing. I myself am guilty of having been like, well, if it got this far, it must be okay. They're often written to be like, make it sound like a good idea. They get to the ballot, and voters tend to approve of them. So one of the things, we'll get to some of this, but one of the things that's going to need to change is that we are all going to have to pay more attention to what's on the ballot and learn to say yes or no, because of course the voters should decide on certain things. But it's worth noting that in Pennsylvania, we don't have ballot measures initiative, so voters can't actually get something on the ballot. Only the legislature can put things on the ballot. So it's another way that they control things. And as Mark talked about, they are proposing changes and changes to the balance of power for the courts, for putting limits on the governor's power, and even putting limits on the power of voters through limiting how elections are handled and voting. So we'll talk about that. There are a series of other issues, like proposals to limit the reproductive freedom. We'll put a link in, but Pennsylvania Spotlight actually has a constitutional ballot tracker, and where you can go in and look up all of the different proposals. So we'll send that out or add it as a link. Again, constitutional amendments should be focused on structural problems in governments, people's rights. They shouldn't be a replacement for legislation. There should be a lot of opportunity for hearings and a vetting of it. Both parties, majority and minority, should have access to getting proposals to move forward. And right now, something can actually whip through the House and the Senate really fast with very little notice. And so that is yet another challenge. And the other thing is that legislators can time things so that they go to, for example, just primaries in off-year elections, where you get high turnout of super voters and low turnout of lots of other people. So one of the proposals, a good policy solution would be that they could only go during general elections during even years, which are the ones with the highest turnout. And we need to make sure that, as I said, that voters, that we're educating people about the fact that we are all going to have to become more discerning participants and say, you know, how's this one? Yes or no? More reading and writing about it. So with that, Mark, am I doing this one, legislation?
Yes.
Okay. So a lot of proposals to put limits on voting, including through constitutional amendments and legislation. So the constitutional amendments include Senate Bill 106, House Bill 1596, and then legislation in House Bill 1800. House Bill 1300 was a whole litany of bad proposals that was passed by both the House and the Senate in June. The governor vetoed it, but then it came back as House Bill 1800. And the legislature continues. The House State Government Committee keeps proposing to put it forward and pass it. So it contains things like voter ID, restrictions on ballot boxes, restrictions on satellite offices, changes to stricter provisions about the administrative procedures that people need to follow, limits on early voting. And actually now there are proposals to completely eliminate mail voting, which was passed in 2019 Act 77, which was one of the best updates to Pennsylvania voter law, and included, there were some bad things about it. It eliminated straight ticket voting, but it did include voting by mail as a massive way to an opportunity for people to exercise their franchise, thus making it more convenient for voters. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But the other thing that's been happening is that the legislature has been using its power to pursue ways to overturn, interfere, or subvert the will of the voters. So there have been numerous court challenges, including to vote by mail, including to whether or not ballots can be counted. If everyone remembers the naked ballot, whether or not you had to have a secrecy envelope. There was just a case up in the Lehigh Valley that is continuing to be litigated about voters' undated ballots, which, who cares if you didn't write the date on it, as long as it shows up, when it's supposed to show up. And if you don't have a secrecy envelope, for example, it's my right to secrecy. So voters, generally speaking, should not be disenfranchised by smaller technical issues. If you're allowed to vote and you conducted your vote in a reasonable manner, you're really not supposed to be able to play gotcha on voters. The other thing is as we all know, that there was the big lie, massive attempts, both direct, to overturn the elections, including storming the Capitol. We now have a candidate running for governor who was there at the time. But there were also efforts to create a slate of alternative electors and certify them. We'll share some links at the end about this. Now there's a new theory called the Independent State Legislature Doctrine, which suggests that they alone, it's a fringe theory, that it would alter election administration across the country, again, continuing to put power in the hands of legislature and legislators, instead of creating these systems where you have, as Mark said, checks and balances. I'm going to go to the, we do know things about how the public feels about this. People really do not want, by 2 to 1, more than 2 to 1, do not want the Pennsylvania State Legislature to be able to overturn the results of the election after the results have been certified. This is actually from this year, Muhlenberg College. The Senate Intergovernmental Operations Committee, I think most people followed this, but it's worthy of a quick recap here. This is not the committee that actually usually deals with elections. That's the State Government Committee in both the House and the Senate. But Doug Mastriano, who was the state senator who was part of the Capitol insurrection, was the chair of the committee at the time, and they decided to subpoena voter files of the voter records of every single voter in Pennsylvania. They also included in their subpoena request private data like the last 4 digits of your social security number and your driver's license, which are used to validate examples of the kinds of ID that can validate a voter when they register, but should not be, or really have an internal validation purpose. They're not really intended to be public data, thus putting 9 million voters at risk of having their private data exposed. And it wasn't even the committee that actually has oversight over elections. They hired a private vendor called Envoy Sage, which has a pretty minimal background. It looks like it's a guy in Iowa. And the contract is with the Pennsylvania GOP caucus. Now that's a taxpayer funded body. The tax dollars go to fund the caucuses for both the GOP and the Democrats. But the contract wasn't with the House and the Senate, it was with the GOP caucus. So the GOP caucus hired a vendor, a partisan vendor, basically, to look at private voter data. So it's unclear whether or not all of the committee members, for example, would get the results of any analysis that they do, would get a chance to understand. They have not said what they're looking for. This matter is being litigated, and it's still pending. They're still seeking the data, but actually a reporter, and we, Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, and We the People actually helped co-sponsor a forum where this reporter came and presented. He said, well, I wonder what they think they're looking for. So he actually got the voter file and did an analysis, a really deep dive, and go figure, he did not find irregularities. That'll be in the links. It's a great article, and I'm happy to provide more information. He did a nice job. So the other big threat is undermining the systems that allow you to actually carry out your elections. So there have been consistently inadequate state funding. Counties carry the great responsibility for this. And now there's legislation, as folks may have heard, there was a huge grant opportunity available literally to every county in the United States in 2020 to help with election operations because of an assessment that there was insufficient equipment and people, especially given the pandemic and the expected high turnout. Now we're considering legislation in Pennsylvania to cut off private funding. And just as a quick point, worth noting that there are all grants fund functions of government all the time. Hello, education, schools get grants all the time. Cleanup, parks and rivers, healthcare, mental health care, health facilities, all kinds of things are funded by private funding. So cutting off private funding for one area of government is a little strange, clearly not coming from the greatest of places. One of the mantras that I like that helps keep me calm is that nothing bad will get signed. We have a governor who is actually functioning in that checks and balances role. No good legislation is going to get passed, though, by the General Assembly as it is currently with the current makeup of the General Assembly and leadership, and nothing bad will get signed. But that is one of the reasons, or the reason, that the General Assembly has turned to this questionable process around constitutional amendments, where they actually want to start putting into our Constitution the kinds of ID people will have to provide to be able to prove that they're an eligible voter. Which is very strange. Again, we will provide a link. There's a great legislation tracker for Voting Rights Lab, one of the national organizations, and they actually put in an analysis, a very objective analysis about whether or not something is pro-voter or anti-voter. And there are good policy proposals. We do have people in Pennsylvania, including legislators, looking at what the right set of policies are for Pennsylvania. Joanna McClinton is the minority leader, and she actually put together a great package after consulting with national experts, advocacy organizations, and policy organizations. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So yes, 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? For those of you who remember, Country Joe and the Fish, I think. Country Joe. Is that right? Did I get that one right? Yeah. So we need to fund the elections that we want to have. Right now, counties carry nearly all the costs. Election administration is people, equipment, and space. We need both the state and the federal government to provide funding. There is a new proposal out. President Biden has offered a package on federal funding that would actually help, for example, address postage. and provide more funding for equipment and election infrastructure. The state, Pennsylvania Department of State has a new request in to increase the number of people they have. Pennsylvania, despite being the 5th largest state, has the 5th smallest number of election staff in the country. So that's pretty stunning. Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center has put forth a proposal and sent a letter to the General Assembly asking them to add $18,318,000 to the budget. That would provide exactly $1,000 per voting precinct or voting division per election to every to every county. So that would distribute funding in accordance with the number of polling places and polling divisions that have to operate. We pay poll workers, we pay site costs. So it's a formula, but it doesn't actually attach to those cost items. We actually need poll worker pay to go up, so we don't want there to be any incentives to make it go down, which would also in turn free up local funding. And so some counties that need space could get space, some counties that need people could get people, counties that need equipment could decide to use dollars on equipment. Mark, you want me to do this one and then you close it up?
Sure.
All right. I think a key issue here is that really our policy needs to be orientated around that voters are at the center of what happens, right? The goal should be for every eligible voter to vote in a manner that is convenient for them at a time that's convenient. I actually was in Oregon at one point where it's an all vote by mail state, for example, and my cousins and my aunt from actually a variety of political perspectives were all like, well, we just get a package in the mail and we get a chance to sit and consider our choices and then mail it in whenever it's convenient for us. Like, why is that a problem? And that was both Republicans and Democrats in that conversation. We bank, which is sensitive information. We do healthcare policy at times that are convenient for us in a manner that is convenient for us and getting more convenient. We need to ensure the legislation cannot overturn the will of the voters, that legislatures cannot replace the voters' choices with their own. Redistricting is going to need to remain a priority, even though we feel like we just finished and there were some gains made. We were still undoing 2 decades of really strong gerrymandering. And if we let it, we were also very fortunate that we had a chair that really decided to use the role to the fullest extent. And if we don't have that again, if we don't make sure that there are changes, that we adopt proposals and legal guidance about what needs to be considered in redistricting, we're going to and make sure that we stop the legislature from being able to overturn a legislative redistricting decision. We're going to be right back where we've been. So a couple other policies. Mark, back to you.
I'm on this slide, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we want elections to be run, as Susan said, in ways that encourage people to vote, make it easier to vote, and also keep voting secure. Those goals are not incompatible. Once we put aside the big lie about our elections, we recognize our elections are pretty secure now, and we have to make sure they stay secure, but we can do that and help people vote. One thing we want is same-day registration. We want you to be able to go to your polling place or a polling place or an election office and say, I'm a new voter, or I've never voted before in this city or this community, and I want to vote. So here's who I am, sign me up, let me vote. We want early voting. We want people to be able to vote early in the before election day. This is becoming a trend all over the country. The way to do that is vote by mail, or you get a ballot by mail and you drop it in a ballot box, or you take it to a satellite office, or you go to a satellite election office and you say, give me a ballot and I'm going to vote right now. Or we have regular polling places set up so you can vote. There are lots of ways to do early voting. And we need to make that happen here. Now, we don't want to be too early. I think one thing we all understand is that election campaigns have a rhythm, and people should have an opportunity to hear what the candidates have to say, see debates and so forth. And so we wanted somewhat limited. 50 days seems about right. And most people, frankly, don't vote that early because they want to hear what the candidates have to say. But, as our experience showed in Pennsylvania, 25 days out, people started voting because they knew who they wanted to vote for, and they wanted to do it when it was convenient for them. So they came out to vote. Now, to do all that, we should have permanent vote by mail. We should have you sign up and say, I always want to vote by mail. So just send me the ballot. Don't make me reapply every election. Don't make me reapply every year. Just send me the ballot. We should also enable people to manage that. Say they decide, this time I want to vote in person. So I go online and say, don't send me a ballot this year. I'll go in person. And if they do that, then you can go in person on election day, or you can go to a satellite office, get a ballot and vote then, or go to an early voting station and vote then. We've talked about satellite offices. There should be a minimum number per population, and they should be fairly distributed. One of the things we've seen around the country where voting districts have been consolidated, satellite offices have been closed, and they've been consolidated and closed in ways that target certain kinds of voters. Typically, in a lot of states, you see voters in Black neighborhoods or in Democratic neighborhoods are losing their polling places, don't have convenient satellite offices. We can easily calculate an algorithm that says you have to have a minimum satellite offices for every county, and that they have to be distributed so that everyone has an equal chance to get to a satellite office within reason. Same thing with ballot boxes. We want people to be able to drop their ballots in a ballot box if they get them early by mail. Again, there should be a minimum number by population, and there should be rules to distribute fairly so everyone can just travel a short distance to drop a ballot in a ballot box. We've been telling you some things to really worry about. We've been telling you some things just now that we want. How do we fight back? Well, one thing is with proactive policy solutions. Susan mentioned that Leader McClinton has introduced legislation. There's also sponsors of it in the Senate, and Governor Wolf is supported for a pretty close to ideal set of rules. It's not totally perfect, but it's come a long way. We and other advocates have been talking with the House, Senate, and the governor's office to make this bill as good as possible. And it would be an enormous improvement if that legislation were enacted. It probably will not be enacted by the Republican majority, but we need to be talking about it. We need to be getting Pennsylvanians to understand that there is a better way to do things. And also that the things that we have to fight back against, that these constitutional amendments, both the process we use to put them forward and the tendency of those amendments, which, as I pointed out, would lead to a massive expansion of the power of the General Assembly, a weakening of the governor, weakening of the courts. And if the legislative redistricting proposals go through, basically an end to our democratic control over our own legislature, that has to stop. So we intend to work with advocates from a number of different organizations and with many of you to build support for fighting back against the things we oppose and for supporting the kinds of legislation that would make voting fair and that would strengthen the checks and balances and strengthen democratic control over government. So stay tuned. There are going to be educational forums we're going to be holding around the state, sharing the kind of information that we're sharing today. And then, in fact, this was a bit of a trial run for some of those educational forums we're thinking about. So we're very interested in hearing your opinion of what you've heard today, and tell us where we got too wonky, tell us where you need more information. That would be very helpful for us. We intend to share social media, pointing people to some of the threats and pointing people to some of the things we want to support, including more funding for elections, including the Clinton election bill. And we're asking you if you want to host an event. We want to send people out to talk to small groups of voters around the state, telling them about some of the difficulties we're facing, some of the threats to our democracy, and some of the potential we have for improving it. So I think that is it. Oh, we'll send out this deck to everyone, and we've included some further reading. Susan and I have been writing a lot of stuff lately about all these threats to our democracy and the GOP design, that is the where we think they're heading in terms of undermining our democracy. So there's lots to read, and we welcome you to take a look at all that stuff. And with that, I think we're open to taking questions. If anyone has a question, please. I think we're a small enough group. You can just unmute yourself and ask a question or put it in the chat.
While folks are deciding if they're going to ask a question, I am going to just do a quick plug in case anyone drops. We do have our final set of sessions next week, including fixing Pennsylvania's upside down tax system, and then talking about federal infrastructure to improve jobs and community benefits. And then our closing legislative panel, which has got a great lineup of legislators who really focus on these issues. So we would invite you to make sure to come next week. I just want to plug those sessions. I learned something every year at these, and it's great to hear who's prepared to do what. So we'll see if we have any questions or comments. Sandra, you came off mute. Did you have something?
I did. I've been following a little bit of the new group called the new initiative for Fix Harrisburg. Will that address any of the issues with the all the constitutional amendment philandering? I mean, I think that's absurd. And I agree that people have a tendency to vote yes on them. So they found that as a way to maneuver. But the Fix Harrisburg is just to help with the committee structure and actually moving our own internal bills, correct?
Yeah, Fix Harrisburg is an effort that is being managed. It's a campaign of fair districts. One of the things that was very frustrating to the folks in fair districts is that the inability to move legislation, including where they heard that they had support from legislators on both sides of the aisle. And that is one of the both truths and tricks of Harrisburg, right? So there will be legislators on both sides of the aisle who actually agree about something, or will just say that they agree about something and that they can't do anything about it, but they can't get the legislation to move. So there's no mechanism to force a committee vote. And the minority party has little power. So there's a set of rules in Harrisburg that really give a very, very few set of people, a select group of people, almost all of the power. And so they are really, and that was one of the big barriers to getting a number of reforms passed that would have helped with redistricting. So the folks there are fired up about it, and that's what they're going to be working on. So it's really about the legislative rules. It could help with some of these things, but as we said, the problem right now is that nothing good will pass. So this is really about public awareness, making sure that people understand what the challenges are to getting anything positive done in Harrisburg. And why we need to make sure that we are vigilant, and why we need to make sure that we are looking under the hood when somebody's like, we've got an election reform package. We have to be critical thinkers, right? Skeptics, and ready to go out and tell people in the community, because most people aren't like us sitting, listening to sessions of policy wonks talking about election policy.
Thank you. It's for someone who tries to do policy and advocacy, it's been a rough road on so many different fronts. And I've been part of fair districts, and I try to follow all of your work here as well. It's just disheartening. So I appreciate, and I hope to support whatever efforts you guys need.
Well, let me just make one quick comment about that. You know, it sometimes these things can be disheartening, but I think there's a couple of one of the analogies that I really like to think about is, you know, it's like living in a floodplain, right? So sometimes you are Sometimes you are planting because you are dealing with the fertile ground and fertile dirt that has been carefully, and you are harvesting the fruits of your labor. And sometimes you are just putting up sandbags, and other times you are, bailing things out and trying to get the water out of your house and off your land. But it's always work to do. And we as advocates we don't get to get tired, right? We can get a little discouraged. But make sure that, our fellow Americans, our fellow Pennsylvanians are counting on us to sound the alarm when something's wrong, to help explain it and make it make sense to people, and help make sure that we demystify both the process. And so I think it's really important that we're out there, really calling for the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. This is not an immutable fact. These are just decisions that get made, and we need to keep the pressure on. We have won things. Mark was one of both Pennsylvania and national leaders on healthcare. So one of my favorite quotes of all time is Bill Clinton's. I know he's not as popular as he once was, but he said, "We stumble forward," right? There is progress to be made here, and we are definitely able to help check against these overreaches for legislative power. So they can keep coming, and I'll still stand there. I might get pissed off sometimes, but.
So if I could just add briefly, there's reasons for optimism, but there's also reasons to be very, very afraid. And we say this every 2 years, this is the most important election in our lives, but frankly, the 22 election is the most important election we will see in Pennsylvania in a very, very long time. The tendencies we've seen towards undermining our democracy are very, very real. If the elections return people to power who want to keep moving in that direction, 2022 could be the last democratic election we ever see in Pennsylvania. And that means that the 2024 presidential election will be problematic as well. There was serious talk in 2020 of the General Assembly taking back the power to choose electors from the people of Pennsylvania and giving it to themselves. They have the right to do that under the United States Constitution. One of the things that stopped them from doing that is, I think they believed rightly that if the General Assembly decided to ignore the electoral votes chosen by the voters and chose electoral votes themselves, they would all be voted out of office in the next election. Now think what happens. If you have a General Assembly that wants to choose the presidential electors and is not worried about elections anymore because the elections are so gerrymandered that they cannot lose, not only Pennsylvania's democracy, but the democracy of the United States will be threatened. So I hate to be, let me put it this way. In John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, he says that people don't make revolutions, willy-nilly. People are always saying there's problems and there's threats toward our democracy and tyranny is coming. And most of the time those people are ignored. But there are times those people are very valuable because their threats are real and someone has to wake up for them. So I think it's my role in life right now to warn people of these threats. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm overstating them, but I'd rather be wrong in warning people about threats to democracy in Pennsylvania, in this country, and have people act now to stop those threats than to be right and not say anything and then us lose democratic government in our state and our country.
It does not look like we have any more questions. What we're going to do is give folks one more chance to make any quick comments, and then we're going to wrap. You will get the access to the slide. The recording has been broadcast, and we'll make sure that folks have the links as well to the information that we shared. And we are here, as always, to follow up on questions. And again, if you have an opportunity if there's a group that you work with and you'd like us to help come talk about some of these issues and help both get people really discouraged, but also really fired up. That's our job. That's our perfect balancing act. Frightened but not so frightened that we are paralyzed. Frightened to the point of being willing to get out there and do what needs to get done so we can actually make the positive change. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Mark. Your political acumen and your long history and your deep understanding is always helpful. It's great to work with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center team. So thanks to all of you for coming. And I know all of you are out there helping to talk in your community. So we appreciate all of you.
Thanks. And thanks to Susan, who spearheads this work for our organization and has been really one of the leaders in saving our democracy in Pennsylvania. So thank you for your work, and thank you all for being here today. And hope to see you at our summit sessions a week from today.